They called him Manila John, but on Guadalcanal, he became something else entirely. John Basilone wasn't supposed to be a legend. He was just a kid from Raritan, New Jersey, who'd spent time in the Philippines with the army before coming home to work as a caddy and truck driver. But when war broke out, something pulled him back. He enlisted in the Marines in 1940, and by October 1942, he found himself in hell on earth, a fetid jungle island in the Solomon chain where America was making its first major offensive against the Japanese Empire. The night of October 24th started like any other nightmare on Guadalcanal. The Marines had been on the island since August, clinging to Henderson Field like it was the only solid ground left in the world. The airfield was everything. If the Japanese took it back, they'd control the skies and the seas around the Solomons, and the entire Pacific War effort could collapse. Everyone knew it. The Japanese knew it too, which is why they kept coming in waves that seemed endless, human tsunami after human tsunami crashing against the Marine lines. Basilone was a sergeant in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, the M1917 Brownings that could spit out 450 rounds per minute when they were working right. His position was on a ridge near the Lunga River, part of a thin defensive line that stretched along the jungle edge. The terrain was brutal, thick vegetation that limited sight lines to just a few yards in some places, and the rain had turned everything into sucking mud that made resupply nearly impossible. When darkness fell that night, Basilone and his 15 men settled into their positions, checking ammunition belts, adjusting fields of fire, knowing that something was coming but not knowing how bad it would be. They didn't have to wait long. Around 10 o'clock, Japanese artillery opened up, and then came the sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Thousands of Japanese soldiers screaming, "Banzai," as they charged through the jungle. This wasn't a probe or a raid. This was Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakate's main assault, 2 entire divisions committed to taking Henderson Field, or dying in the attempt. Most of them would do the latter. The first waves hit Basilone's position like a freight train. The machine guns opened up, red tracers cutting through the darkness, and Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens, but they kept coming. The thing about a Banzai charge is that it's both tactically insane and psychologically terrifying. You're watching men run straight into fire, watching them die, and still they come, climbing over their own dead, and you start to wonder if your ammunition will run out before their bodies do. Basilone moved between his 2-gun crews like a man possessed. When one gun would overheat from sustained fire, he'd be there with water to cool the barrel. When ammunition ran low, he'd sprint through enemy fire back to supply points that were themselves under attack. The Marine Corps had taught him that a machine gun without ammunition was just an awkward club, and he'd be damned if his guns would go silent. He carried 90-pound ammunition belts through the jungle like they were grocery bags, making trip after trip, while Japanese bullets snapped through the air around him. By midnight, half his men were dead or wounded. The Japanese had figured out where the machine guns were and were concentrating their fire, sending squad after squad to try and overwhelm the position. Basilone's hands were burned from changing hot barrels, his uniform was soaked with blood, some his, most not, and the air was thick with cordite smoke and the smell of death. But the guns kept firing. Around 2 in the morning, something happened that should have ended everything. One of the machine guns jammed, the belt feed mechanism clogged with mud and carbon. In the middle of a firefight, with Japanese soldiers barely 20 yards away, Basilone didn't have time for the proper cleaning procedure. He stripped the gun down by feel in the darkness, cleared the jam, and had it back in action in under a minute. The Marine next to him later said he did it faster than most men could do it in daylight on a clean firing range. But the ammunition situation was becoming critical. The supply lines had been cut, and the Japanese were between Basilone's position and the nearest ammunition dump. He could hear other Marine positions to his left and right being overrun, could hear the screaming and the hand-to-hand fighting, and he knew that if his guns went silent, this entire section of the line would collapse. So he did what seemed impossible. He organized a combat resupply mission through enemy-held ground. Taking 2 men with him, Basilone moved through the jungle toward where he thought the supplies were. They used their pistols and knives, killing silently when they had to, avoiding enemy patrols when they could. They found the ammunition dump partly destroyed, Japanese soldiers milling around it, and they had to fight their way in and out. Basilone killed several enemy soldiers with his pistol at point-blank range, grabbed as much ammunition as 3 men could carry, and led his tiny team back through the darkness to their position. The second night was worse than the first. The Japanese came again, this time with better intelligence about where the machine gun positions were. They brought up light artillery and mortars, trying to knock out the guns before sending in their infantry. Basilone's position took several direct hits. More of his men died. At one point, he was the only man left manning one of the guns, firing with one hand while he fed the belt with the other, a technique that should be impossible but which witnesses swore they saw him do. He refused to pull back even when ordered to withdraw to a secondary position. He understood something that maybe only someone who'd seen as much combat as he had could understand. If these guns stopped firing, the Japanese would pour through the gap like water through a broken dam, and Henderson Field would be lost. So he stayed collecting weapons from the dead, firing captured Japanese rifles when he ran low on machine gun ammunition, throwing grenades, doing whatever it took to hold that piece of ground. The third day brought more of the same horror. By now, Basilone had been awake for over 60 hours straight, fighting almost continuously. His body should have been shutting down from exhaustion, but adrenaline and will kept him moving. The area around his position was carpeted with Japanese dead, stacked in some places 3 and 4 deep. The smell was indescribable. The flies were everywhere. But still the Japanese commanders sent more men forward, convinced that one more push would break through. What's remarkable is that Basilone didn't just fight, he led. He kept his surviving men together, kept their morale up, redistributed ammunition, coordinated fields of fire, called in what little artillery support was available. He turned a desperate defensive position into a killing ground so effective that the Japanese assault, which had succeeded in pushing back Marines at other points along the line, couldn't break through his sector. By the morning of October 26th, the Japanese assault had finally broken. They'd lost thousands of men, their attack had failed, and Henderson Field remained in American hands. When relief forces finally reached Basilone's position, they found him still at his gun, surrounded by dead enemies, his hands so badly burned and cut that he could barely move his fingers. Of the 15 men in his section, only he and 2 others were still alive and unwounded. The numbers are staggering and still debated. The official citation for his Medal of Honor says that enemy dead in his sector numbered in the hundreds. Other accounts, including from Japanese sources captured later, suggest that the number of enemy soldiers killed by fire from Basilone's machine gun section during those 3 days was close to 2,000. Whether it was 500 or 2,000, the result was the same. One Marine sergeant and his crew had held a critical position against overwhelming odds and changed the course of a battle. The Medal of Honor came quickly, presented by General Douglas MacArthur himself. Basilone became an instant celebrity, pulled from the Pacific to tour the United States selling war bonds. He was feted at dinners, photographed with movie stars, treated like the hero he was, but something in him couldn't accept it. He'd lost too many friends on Guadalcanal. While he was signing autographs and making speeches, Marines were still dying on islands whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. He requested to return to combat. The Marine Corps wanted to keep him stateside where he was valuable for morale and recruitment, but Basilone insisted. He wanted to be with his men, wanted to be where he felt he belonged. They eventually agreed and sent him to train new machine gun crews before shipping him back to the Pacific. On February 19, 1945, Basilone landed with the 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima. He was 38 years old, ancient by infantry standards, and he'd been married just 8 months earlier to a Marine sergeant named Lena May Ridgey. She begged him not to go back, but he told her he had to. The men needed him. He made it off the beach, led his machine gun platoon through the volcanic sand under withering fire, and was helping to guide a tank through a minefield when a Japanese mortar round landed nearby. Shrapnel tore through his body, and he died within minutes. The date was February 19, 1945. The first day of the Iwo Jima invasion. The man who'd survived 3 days of hell on Guadalcanal, who'd become the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II, didn't survive his first day on Iwo Jima. The tragedy of Basilone's death is that he'd already done enough. He'd already proven everything a man could prove about courage and skill and dedication. But he went back anyway, because that's who he was. He couldn't stand the idea of other Marines fighting while he stayed safe at home. In a way, his death validated everything about his legend. He wasn't just a warrior when it was necessary. He was a warrior by nature, someone who couldn't be anything else. Today, There's a parade in his honor every year in Raritan, New Jersey. There are ships and streets and buildings named after him. But the real monument to John Basilone isn't made of bronze or concrete. It's in the story itself, in what one man did on a jungle ridge on Guadalcanal when everything was falling apart, and someone had to hold the line. He held it, for 3 days against impossible odds. With his weapons failing and his men dying around him, he held it. And because he did, Henderson Field stayed in American hands, and the tide of war in the Pacific began to turn. The question people always ask is how. How does one man do what Basilone did? How do you fight for 3 days straight? How do you keep going when you're wounded and exhausted and everyone around you is dying? The answer is that we don't really know. We can talk about training and instinct and leadership, but those words don't capture it. What Basilone did on Guadalcanal was something that exists at the far edge of human capability, something that happens when a rare combination of skill, courage, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit comes together in one person at one moment. What we do know is that it happened. The witnesses were there, American and Japanese both. The bodies were counted. The ground was held. And a kid from New Jersey became something that sounds too incredible to be true but is true anyway. A man who fought like an army, who held a position that should have been overrun a dozen times, who kept his guns firing when by all rights they should have gone silent. They called him Manila John, but after Guadalcanal, they called him something else too. They called him the man who couldn't be stopped, the sergeant who fought like a demon, the Marine who held the line when holding the line seemed impossible. And every word of it was true.